I'm committed. I'm committed.
Yes, it's OGP, the One Giant podcast, coming to you on a Tuesday with what else? Updates for the New York Football Giants offseason. We said we were going to start to kick this into high gear as the Giants move into the big decisions that need to happen here. First domino that falls, Dave Gettleman, quote unquote, retires. That's what we wanted to see. You've heard something from some people around the league around what they would have preferred the scenario to be on his exit. We'll talk about him a little bit. And then we're also, of course, going to talk about Joe Judge, what John Mara and the organization seems to be trending in the direction of, and then highlight a growing list of candidates that the Giants are going to look to talk to when it comes to filling the GM vacancy. So the first piece, quickly, on Dave Gettleman. Some people were saying, this is a guy that deserves to be fired for what happened. The Giants give him a nice send-off. They tell him, hey, thank you, 35 years in the league, all the kind of glowing review stuff that, you expect from a classy organization like the Giants. I don't have any problem with it. We all know where he succeeded or failed. We all know that if Daniel Jones doesn't work out, that's obviously going to be the ultimate stain on what he accomplished or didn't with the New York Giants. For everything that was good and bad, and a lot of bad with his time here, if Daniel Jones ended up being a franchise quarterback, then it's a win overall because it's hard to find the franchise quarterback, and you could forgive some of the missteps probably along the way. That being the case, it looks like we're moving more in the direction of that being a bigger and bigger question mark. And then that would only further compound some of the things that we saw over Dave Gettleman's tenure, the allocation of assets to a running back at the top end of the draft, the misfires and somewhat panic moves in the offseason when we talk about going and getting Kenny Golladay, only wide receiver on the market, competing against no one. When we talk about going out and wanting to get Norwell, missing on him, not getting Okung, and then overspending on a guy like Nate Solder, who ultimately fizzles. So listen, there's a lot of things we could critique about Dave Gettleman. Ultimately, he's gone. So that's the first thing that we all agreed as Giants fans we wanted to see for the New York Football Giants, and we've accomplished that. Now, step number 2 in this process is what happens with Joe Judge. And what it looks like right now is that he's going to be safe, at least for the time being. And putting everything about the season aside for the moment, the idea coming into these last handful of games and going into the offseason is that John Mara feels like I've got the guy in Joe Judge. Now, there's been a handful of different things that have been thrown into the pot here, one of which is John Mara is sick of all the turnover that they've had at GM and at head coach and the different systems and everything that's gone on. So you want to try to avoid that. And you then staying committed to a head coach, that isn't the best fit. That's the concern, that because you've made mistakes, you're going to compound those mistakes by making another mistake, right? That being said, though, the other indication here, and I think where they're playing a little bit, close to the vest, so to speak, is that they're looking at this as an opportunity to say, we're going to do our GM search. They've had lengthy conversations with Joe Judge. They've allowed him to make his case. I think that if you're Joe Judge right now, you're in the room saying, I need more input. I need more control. I need more say about what goes on in the organization, how we allocate assets. We'll never know fully where were disagreements behind closed doors about where a draft pick should be used, what targets they should go after in free agency, all of that stuff, right? If we don't have a strong sense of where Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman maybe disagreed, we heard some things around Kevin Abrams and disagreeing with Gettleman over the last couple of years. If we don't have a sense of that, that's the case that's being made behind closed doors. I wouldn't have done this. I would have done that. This is where I think we can get better. I need to be a stronger voice in the room. If you make that case to John Mara and Steve Tisch, who's back in the building, I'm not entirely sure why Giants fans are so excited about an absentee owner showing up to be a part of this process. It's not a knock on him, and John Mara hasn't been glowing in his own right, but What does Steve Tisch bring to the table other than the desire to have a better product? Everybody wants that. But the point being is that Joe Judge is making this case to them. And it seems like at the very least, the Giants are willing to say, you're the head coach. But to Andy Mack's wishes, it looks like they're also going to say that when we bring in the next GM, if he comes in and meets with you, Joe Judge, and he decides I want to go a different way, we're not going to stop him. And that's all right then. It's okay to approach this offseason in that regard. We feel like we'd be comfortable moving forward with him, but we're not going to stop anyone from saying it's time to go a different direction. Likewise for any of the player or personnel, right? If the new GM comes in and he says, I like Joe Judge. By the way, maybe Joe Judge is saying he doesn't like Daniel Jones. But if Joe Judge says he wants to keep Daniel Jones, but the GM says, well, I'll keep you, Judge, but we're moving on from Jones. Or I want to bring in competition at the position. Or I'm moving on from both of you. Or I like Daniel Jones, but I don't like the head coach, right? Any number of these scenarios can play themselves out as long as the premise is whoever we hire is going to have full autonomy to make the decisions that they want to make. That's the most important thing to take out of this. Can we sit here and say, I prefer that you just clean break from Joe Judge and move on? Sure. But I think it's okay to, on January 11th, say, as of right now, we're going to stick with him. Again, new GM comes in, he has a coach that he loves, fine. And we're going to get into a couple of these candidates here, and there are some ties inside of organizations and coordinators that make a lot of sense to be brought with some of these candidates. So be it. And one of the things that I'll touch on here before we get into those candidates, and it started out with a 2 or 3, and now already this morning here, it's expanded to add another couple of names and from quality organizations. So I think you have to like what at least you're hearing the Giants are looking to do, who they want to speak with. The net that they're casting right now is wide, not only from who they're talking to, who they're looking to talk to, but also the type of people they're looking to talk to. It's not just strictly executive positions that have been inside the inner workings of organizations. That's a good thing. We also have a former player on this list that has now been inside of an organization, but I think they're willing to look at it from as broad of a spectrum as they ever have because they know how things have or have not worked. But the one thing you have to be sure of here is that you're making these meetings, getting these guys in the room, having the discussions, and making your decisions not as quickly as possible, but you go back and you track through the Giants' process on GMs and on head coaches. And I think we mentioned this last episode. Remember, Pat Shurmur was the byproduct of not getting interviews quickly in time, right? Being patient, waiting it out, seeing, okay. And then ultimately you end up with Shurmur. And the results of him are here, neither here nor there. It's not about if he got a fair shake or he was the right or wrong guy. It's just you ended up with him. It's kind of the same thing with Dave Gettleman. You chose to go that route because you felt comfortable with it, not because you were willing to hear outside perspectives, not because you were willing to hear, at the time, Lewis critics say, well, I'll come in, but I'm going to prepare the next quarterback for the future. If you're not ready for that, then we're going to go a different way. So you end up going with a comfortable choice as opposed to allowing a candidate to organically convince you they're the right person for the job. So you don't want to be caught on the back foot. You know that depending on which GM it is, that's the kind of thing that's the hire that you can make sooner than later. The head coach could be a little bit different. If it's coming off of a playoff team right now, then you're going to have to wait out the playoffs. Certainly, you may be able to squeeze in a meeting in between different playoff rounds, so that's a factor as well. But when you look at the schedule of how the offseason goes, remember, by the time the playoffs and the Super Bowl are done, you're only a month away from the offseason free agency starting. Then you're only another month away from the draft and needing to prepare for that. And any new GM, you want to get them in the building and be able to evaluate the talent on the roster. There's a number of decisions that have to get made here internally, regardless of what happens outside, free agency, draft, trades, anything else like that. So getting the GM in as quickly as possible is important. Making sure it's the right guy, that's important as well. And hopefully the Giants are going to be doing that. Inside of these candidates, so I just want to run them down really quick here. Not too quick, but quick enough. Because listen, these are all meetings. We don't know what's going to come of them. There's a couple of good ones, I think, that really jump out to you because not only these are ones that have ties to the New York Giants organization, but also because they have a track record of success. The big one that seems to be on Giants' minds is Schoen, the assistant GM with the Buffalo Bills right now. And this would be a scenario where if you like the coordinator there, offensive coordinator, then this is probably a 1-1. The assistant GM comes in. He may look to that roster, that coaching staff, and say, I've got my guy. So will I discuss with Joe Judge? Sure. But if you're bringing me in, I want to go ahead and bring in the head coach that I know I'm on the same page with because I've been developing players and rosters with him underneath the head coach over the last handful of seasons. Now, if you're talking about getting completely away from, ties to the New York Football Giants organization, it's a little bit, this one is the one that has a little bit of ties because this goes back to Bean, who was the assistant GM underneath Dave Gettleman in Carolina. He went and took the general manager position ultimately in Buffalo and brought Schoen with him. So this is a little bit off of that tree, right? Schoen was with the Dolphins as well as director of player personnel 2014 to 2017, worked under former Jets general manager Mike Tannenbaum as well. Also did some assistant director of college scouting along the way. So, he has this, I would think you'd say traditional mold, right? The track record of building up through an organization, checking different boxes along the way, and then rising to an opportunity to become the GM of an organization. The other one that they looked at here as well is going to be Chiefs Executive Director of Player Personnel, Ryan Pohl, and the Titans Vice President of Personnel, Ryan Cowden, who's the Director of Player Personnel, Monti Ossenfort. Now, Ossenfort's another guy that has some ties to the New York Football Giants in that he was in Carolina for a long time during Gettleman's tenure and has overlap. I want to make sure I get this right. Cowden has overlap underneath Gettleman in Carolina. Ossenfort has overlap with Joe Judge in New England. So this is where, again, you bring in Joe Judge. He states his case. He wants to stick around. It's fair to probably speculate that if Ossenfort were to come out as one of the top candidates, that then it makes it increasingly more likely that Joe Judge is back. Because we're talking about being on the same page with somebody that I've had conversations with over the years. We like and want to construct a roster in a similar way. And then that's okay. This kind of reverse engineering of having your coach in place and then hiring your GM. There's not a lot of scenarios where I think it's the smart thing to do. The rare one is where Joe Judge has ties to them and you feel like if you could have, maybe you would have gone with Ossenfort or someone connected to Joe Judge when you were going to bring him in. Now, there have been the assistant GM that ultimately landed in Houston that you could have done that with, and you chose not to. But those are a couple of the candidates that initially came out. The second wave that came along here, I want to make sure that I get these guys right. And this is coming out of, and that was 15 years, by the way, for Ossenfort with the New England Patriots, now with Tennessee. And it was while Joe Judge was the assistant head coach there. Titans for the last 2 seasons. So that's the rundown on Ossenfort. The other new names that have come out either late last night, early this morning, would be an interview request for the New York Football Giants for Adam Peters, assistant GM for the San Francisco 49ers, and also Rand Carthen, also with the 49ers, director of player personnel. Peters, in his 18th year working in NFL front office, last 4 seasons as the assistant GM with the San Francisco 49ers. Rand Carthen is a former NFL player, director of pro personnel for the 49ers since 2017, and director of player personnel for the Rams from 2012 to 2016. So again, now you're getting a little bit further away in terms of having these connections to the organization. But just on its surface, someone like Rand Carthen, who has been with an organization that, in spite of having a lot of injuries last year, develops their roster very well. They fill out positions very well. They draft very well. So that means they scout successfully, we think, at the college level. And then even go to the Rams. The Rams have been a very well-built organization. They've made some moves this year, the last year and a half, to bring in outside players to try to get them over the hump here. But they did a great job of building up that roster organically. So that's a nice track record that you could be excited about. Another former player would be Adrian Wilson, now with the Arizona Cardinals as the vice president of pro personnel. He was 01 to 2014, safety in the NFL, front office since 2015. Completely outside, former player. And if he has enough time behind the scenes, maybe you feel confident in him that he's starting to show the ability to help develop and cultivate talent. That would be maybe a little bit, I don't say riskier, but that would certainly go against the grain of what the New York Football Giants have been comfortable with in their history. They like lengthy track records. They like guys that have been there. And listen, Dave Gettleman shows you that isn't always necessarily the best way to go, right? He has a heck of a track record, and some of that may have already been bad, and you could have kind of read the tea leaves on that, but he had a lot of experience, had ties to the organization, had been in the league for 35 years. It's okay to go with a young mind. It's okay to give someone an opportunity that you otherwise wouldn't in most circumstances. And by the way, it's kind of what you did with Joe Judge. Nobody was banging down the door to get Joe Judge into their team. And the last couple of years may tell you with good reason. But if you're the Giants and you made this leap of faith on it off a recommendation from Bill Belichick, then maybe it's worth taking a leap on someone else if they impress you. Remember, go back to when Joe Judge interviewed for the job, and right, wrong, and different, but inside a vacuum, all that talk about Matt Rule, right? But the Giants were there, a lot of opportunities, thinking about what they were going to do. Were they going to spend that much money on Rule? Probably not. But they said, listen, Joe Judge came in. He impressed us. He convinced us in the interview that he was the guy we wanted to go forward with. Right, wrong, and different. So you allowed someone to come into the building and convince you that they were the man for the role. Footnote internally that Kevin Abrams is not going to be a candidate. He's currently still with the organization. Role is to be determined. Again, depends on who comes in and how they feel about some of the staff inside. And I'm okay with that as well. Again, new GM comes in. You have a laundry list of players and coaches that have been with the organization, people behind the scenes that have been there. And you say, listen, here's 4 or 5 guys that we really like. We've seen this with the special teams coordinator. He's made it through every single head coach we've had over the last handful of years because he's good at his job. And you say, look, give him a fair shake. Have a conversation with him. If you like what he brings to the table, keep him. If you want to move on, you want to move on. We love for him to get a fair shake. There's going to be some guys within the organization that are going to get that opportunity as well. I don't know if Kevin Abrams is going to be that guy. And this also, again, this comes down to that discussion around, well, are we talking about the offseason moves, free agent moves, draft moves? Who's responsible for it? Somebody made a great, and I'll apologize. I'll put it in the show notes. Shouted it out on YouTube around. We always talk about Ernie Accorsi, the last great architect for the New York Football Giants, but it's fair to say, remember, Abrams was underneath him. Jerry Reese was underneath him, right? So we go from Accorsi to Jerry Reese, and we always think, and then Jerry Reese just totally boondoggles it, and he rides the coattails of Ernie Accorsi's success. But Jerry Reese was there providing information when Accorsi was making decisions about who to draft, who to sign, scouting, etc. So it is fair that sometimes we put everything on one specific person or one specific decision that gets made, but there's a lot of elements that do go into it. So maybe Abrams survives through this in a different capacity with the Giants and is not in the same role that he currently is as assistant GM. I don't know if that's feasible or viable. And again, if you turn around and tell me that Dave Gettleman said, and this is a trickle-down effect, right? Dave Gettleman is in the room with Joe Judge. Joe Judge says, we need a wide receiver. Dave Gettleman says, okay, we'll go get Kenny Golladay. Joe Judge says, yes. I already think that that's a bit of a failing, or that bothers me to some extent. And then you go to Abrams, and Abrams says, yeah, totally. He doesn't say, listen, we can sign him, but we can't sign him for $72 million. You know, these are the discussions that need to happen here. It can't just be that the GM says, go get him, and you make it happen, quote unquote. No, it's got to make viable sense. You have to be able to get from year to year and continue to still open up and correct your cap space. And we've talked about this before. You've failed these last couple of years to make sure that whatever decisions you were making in the background, you were getting yourself to a healthier spot from a cap standpoint. We're still another year away, depending on how you make decisions this offseason, from turning this thing over and really opening up cap room. And then you're going to have guys that you're going to need to sign along the way as well. But being stuck on Bradbury money, and I'm not saying he was a bad signing initially at the time, but being you have his money on the books, you have Kenny Galladay's money on the books, you're going to have Saquon Barkley's money on the books, right? There's a lot of players and a lot of money that has been misallocated. So these are where we stand right now in some of these candidates. I like the idea. A lot of people do of going with Schoen out of Buffalo again, because then you can tap into the offensive coordinator and give him a real opportunity. This is where I think the clean sweep does come in, and you go into this year, and from a franchise perspective, you'd probably say, I still want Daniel Jones on the roster, but you bring in a veteran to compete with him. You look into the draft, you consider what your options are, and maybe find a quarterback that you can develop over the next couple of seasons. Look for a bridge guy and then develop the next quarterback. That may be the scenario we come to. But at the very least, the Giants seem like they're being much more proactive than they were the last time around. It looks like they're going to cast a wider net than they typically would. And it looks like, even in spite of Joe Judge still having his job at this moment, it looks like the Giants are in a spot now where John Mara, Steve Tisch are saying, okay, whatever it looks like, that is what it looks like. If you come in and tell me we need to change X, Y, or Z, I'm not going to give you stipulations to accepting the job. And if at any point it comes out that a new GM is told, but you have to keep Joe Judge, then we're done. And then it's not going to work again. And whoever that GM is one, being given the job with a one hand tie behind his back. And also, just like with Gettleman, it's not the candidate you want, because you want the guy that says, I will take it, but I'm not going to do it if you're telling me I don't have full autonomy to make decisions and try to fix this team, because it's only going to reflect bad back on me. If things don't go well, they're going to talk about the GM and the decisions that were made, just like with Joe Judge, right? If the team doesn't succeed, you're going to look at the head coach. You can try to sell it short on Jason Garrett. That's not the scenario. One interesting footnote that I talked about with familiar name to the show, Pizza Mike, just last night was, if you're looking into these playoffs, and we're going to talk about them later in the week, set up some of these matchups, one of the ones to keep an eye on is the 49ers going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, on the positive side, if you like one of these candidates, the assistant GM there, and the Niners lose, hey, you can dive right in on it. And a bonus to that would be another win or two for the Dallas Cowboys in the playoffs. Bear with me here. I know we're talking about letting the Dallas Cowboys win games.
That don't bother me.
And the reason why it doesn't is because Kellen Moore is obviously a viable head coaching candidate. What would Jerry Jones do if the Dallas Cowboys make it to the NFC Championship game and have success under Mike McCarthy? It's going to be hard to cut ties with him because you don't want to lose Kellen Moore. And Kellen Moore is one of the most sought after offensive minds in the game. Would Jerry Jones just throw a bunch of extra money at him to keep him around there? I'm sure. It's going to be very difficult to get him away from there. But that's certainly someone that you would want the Giants to be looking at if they're going to move off of Joe Judge and if a new GM wants to bring in his own guy. Because the last piece that I almost lost track of before is that the Giants still have failed to modernize their offense. It's been years. And it was supposed to be this wave, and then Daniel Jones, and he's this mobile quarterback. It doesn't matter. The play calling has not been good enough. The style, the scheme, it's still predictable. They have not caught up with where the NFL is right now. And that, more than anything that's gone on, wins or losses or otherwise, my biggest indictment on Joe Judge would be, you didn't come in and change this thing. And I'm not saying the expectations that you were a great offensive mind and that getting Jason Garrett obviously wasn't going to be an innovator on that side of the ball. But here we are after all these years still saying we don't have a plan to be explosive, dynamic, etc. And I have some thoughts around what the Giants maybe could look to do in the draft to start to go in that direction, to build that way. We'll get to that later in the offseason. But that has to be one of the biggest tenets of whoever you bring in as GM. Whether you're keeping Joe Judge, then the offensive coordinator, you need to get progressive with this. And that might be the biggest reason to move off of Joe Judge, is to put someone at the top of this food chain that you know is going to do things on the offensive side to make you explosive, to make you dynamic, to use the playmakers you currently have or the ones you're going to bring in and get this team to a place where you can be competing on a week in, week out basis and not look like we've done it far too often. Here comes the double reverse. Even the trick plays look predictable, right? That's what you need to get away from as well. So that's where we stand right now. Some people think it could take a little bit longer. Again, timetables around which teams progress to the playoffs could affect it, certainly from a head coaching standpoint, if they go that way. But from a GM perspective, listen, if you get a couple of interviews in every single day, starting over the next couple of days or the end of this week into next week, 2-3 weeks tops, I want to see the GM in the building. Because again, the timeline of the decisions you need to make and the process you want to get underway, every single day that you don't have him in place is another day that you're a little bit behind the 8 ball. And there's a lot to figure out. And once we know who the GM is and we know how he feels about the head coach, then we can start to examine this roster. We'll come back in. We're going to do as many bonus episodes as possible. Every time that there's something new to discuss, every time new candidates come up, we'll highlight who they are, think about what it could mean for the Giants potentially, and obviously update anything internally that goes on around behind the scenes. Kevin Abrams, are there other people within the organization that are going to move on? And there's already some tea leaves around certain players that we think the Giants are going to have to move off of, regardless of who's making the decisions at the top and who's running the team on the field. You can follow us on social media. Hit us up over on YouTube with questions. We're really ramping it up over there. If you have a question, if you have a thought, if you have a take on the GM, throw it out there. Ask it. We'll dive in on it. I'll research it. And as I say, I'll put the show notes for the fan who brought it up. I'm going to go back and take a look at Ernie Accorsi's draft classes, into Jerry Reese's draft classes, and really talk about, and free agency, by the way, and examine the two of them side by side. The end of Jerry Reese's run was not pretty, but it doesn't mean that it should be dismissed because he was there underneath and then in charge of winning some Super Bowls for the New York Football Giants. So I think sometimes it's easy just to put the blame at someone's feet and want to get off of it, like we've done, right? Like we're trying to do with Dave Gettleman. He's the problem. Maybe he's part of it, but when you've been as dysfunctional as the Giants have, there's plenty of blame to go around. Follow us on all those great platforms, free to listen to wherever you get those needs fulfilled. And as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know, as always, let's go Big Blue.